Like, and make sure to engage in comments and share this video to your friends and story lovers, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Inquisco for more real and true stories like this. Also, go now in the comments and type down the stories you would like us to post. We will choose the best story and create a video. The first time I set foot in the Mthethwa household, I was struck by its quiet elegance. The sprawling property was a mix of modern design and timeless sophistication, with walls of glass that opened onto a patio overlooking a sparkling infinity pool. Everything about it screamed wealth, but it was the understated kind, less ostentatious and more about good taste. Mrs. Clara Mthethwa, my new employer, had hired me as their live-in cook after an extensive interview process. She was polite but distant, the type of woman who spoke in curt sentences and expected everything to run like clockwork. I didn't take it personally. People like her didn't hire staff for companionship. Her husband Themba was the opposite. I met him formally during my second week. He had come home early from a business trip, and I was setting up dinner when he walked into the kitchen. His presence filled the space instantly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark skin glowing in the evening light filtering through the wide windows. He had a quiet confidence about him, and when he smiled, it was disarmingly warm. "You must be Helen," he said, his deep voice carrying a subtle Zulu accent. "Yes, sir," I replied, glancing up briefly before returning to the plates I was arranging. "Themba," he corrected, leaning casually against the counter. "No need for titles here." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Clara told me you've been doing a great job," he added. "Thank you," I said softly, focusing on the salad I was preparing. Over the following weeks, I saw him in passing, mostly in the evenings when he came home. He always greeted me warmly, his tone lighter than his wife's. Clara was often preoccupied, managing charity events and social gatherings, leaving Themba to his own devices. I noticed how they rarely spent time together, their conversations brief and functional. It wasn't my place to judge, but it was hard not to notice the distance between them. One evening, Clara was away at a gala, and Themba returned home earlier than usual. I was cleaning up the kitchen when he walked in, tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. "Long day?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. He chuckled softly, his eyes meeting mine. "You could say that, but it's nice to come home to a quiet house for once." I smiled, unsure how to respond. "You've got a knack for this," he said, gesturing to the leftovers I had neatly packed away. "The food, the organization, everything." "Thank you," I said, feeling a faint warmth in my cheeks. "Clara made a good choice hiring you," he added, his tone sincere. For a moment, the air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. I quickly busied myself with wiping down the counters, breaking eye contact. Themba lingered for a while, asking me about my background, how I'd come to work for their family. His questions were casual, but his attention was undivided. By the time he left the kitchen, I felt a strange mix of flattery and unease. After that night, his presence became harder to ignore. The way he lingered in the kitchen during meals, the way his eyes seemed to find mine during conversations. It was subtle, but unmistakable. And yet, neither of us acknowledged it, as if unspoken boundaries were the only thing keeping us in check. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when Clara announced she'd be spending the weekend with friends at a luxury spa retreat. She left early in the morning, her suitcase in tow, barely sparing a glance at Themba as he sipped his coffee in the sunlit dining room. "Take care of things while I'm gone," she said briskly, kissing him lightly on the cheek before walking out the door. Themba barely reacted, his focus fixed on his phone. I spent the day preparing meals and tidying up the kitchen. Themba had disappeared into his office upstairs, leaving the house unusually quiet. By mid-afternoon, I decided to take a break. I slipped out to the garden with a glass of lemonade and a book I had borrowed from the INFIDELITy's extensive library. The garden was one of my favorite spots on the property. Rows of neatly trimmed hedges framed clusters of vibrant flowers, and a stone pathway wound its way to a shaded gazebo near the pool. I had just settled into a lounge chair when I heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel. "Mind if I join you?" Themba's voice broke the stillness. I looked up, startled. He was dressed casually in a white shirt and khaki shorts, his usual formal demeanor replaced by something more relaxed. "Of course," I said, sitting up a little straighter. He sat down on the chair next to mine, stretching out his long legs and leaning back. "Clara doesn't know what she's missing, leaving on a day like this," he said, his eyes scanning the clear blue sky. I smiled politely, unsure how to respond. "You like it out here?" he asked, turning his attention to me. "It's peaceful," I admitted. "Sometimes it feels like a world away from everything." He nodded thoughtfully. "I don't get to enjoy it much myself. Work keeps me busy, and when I'm home—" He trailed off, his expression briefly clouded before he shook it off. "Anyway, I'm glad someone's appreciating it." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the soft rustle of leaves and distant hum of birds filling the air. Themba seemed content just to be there, his presence surprisingly unintrusive. But then he turned to me, his gaze lingering longer than it should have. "You're different," he said, his voice low. I frowned slightly. "Different how?" "I don't know," he said with a small shrug. "There's something about you, the way you carry yourself. It's refreshing." I felt a strange flutter in my chest, but I quickly pushed it aside. "I just try to do my job well," I said lightly, trying to deflect the compliment. "It's more than that," he said, his tone firm. "You have a way of making people feel at ease. It's rare." I didn't know how to respond. His words felt sincere, but there was something else beneath them, something that made the space between us feel charged. Before I could say anything, he stood up, brushing imaginary dust off his shorts. "I should probably let you get back to your book," he said, his tone shifting back to casual. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded, giving me one last look before walking back toward the house. For the rest of the afternoon, I found it impossible to concentrate. His words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing more than a harmless conversation. But deep down, I knew better. Later that evening, as I was clearing up after dinner, Themba walked into the kitchen. "Let me help," he said, picking up a towel before I could protest. "That's not necessary," I said quickly. "I insist," he replied, his smile disarming. We worked side by side, the sound of running water and clinking dishes filling the space. At first it was awkward, but then he started telling stories about his childhood in South Africa, about growing up in Durban and spending summers on the beach. I laughed at his anecdotes, surprised by how easily he could make me forget my unease. For a moment, it felt like we were just two people sharing a conversation, not an employer and his cook. But then, as I reached for a dish, our hands brushed. It was a small, fleeting moment, but the jolt it sent through me was undeniable. Our eyes met, and for a second neither of us moved. The weight of what was left unsaid hung heavy in the air, the tension between us almost palpable. I quickly pulled my hand away, turning back to the sink. "I think I've got it from here," I said, my voice shaky. Themba hesitated before stepping back. "Good night, Helen," he said softly, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Good night," I whispered, not daring to look at him. As I heard his footsteps retreating, I let out a shaky breath. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it was dangerous, and yet a part of me couldn't deny the thrill of it, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as shadows from the trees outside danced across it. My mind was restless, replaying every moment with Themba, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the warmth in his gaze, the jolt when our hands touched. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was all harmless, but deep down, I knew the truth. The next morning I tried to avoid him. I busied myself in the kitchen, focusing on preparing the elaborate Sunday brunch Clara had requested in advance. The house was quiet, and I assumed Themba was still upstairs in his office. Around midday, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. I felt his presence before he even spoke. "Morning," he said softly. "Good morning," I replied without looking up, keeping my attention on the chopping board in front of me. "Busy, I see," he said, stepping closer. "It's Sunday brunch," I said, forcing a lightness into my voice. "Lots to prepare." He didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched, heavy and tense. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low. "Helen, can we talk?" I froze, my knife hovering over the vegetables. "About what?" "About us," he said, the words sending a shiver down my spine. "There is no us," I said quickly, turning to face him. "You're my employer, and I'm just—" "You're not just anything," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're someone who's been in my thoughts more than I care to admit." My heart raced, and I took a step back, the counter pressing into my lower back. "Themba, this isn't right. You're married. I'm married." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore how I feel, and I don't think you can either." I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out, because he was right. As much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't. "I think you should go," I finally managed, my voice trembling. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "If that's what you want." "It is," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me feeling both relieved and hollow. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Clara returned in the evening, her usual bright energy filling the house. Themba greeted her warmly, the perfect picture of a loving husband. I avoided him as much as possible, throwing myself into my work and keeping my head down. But that night, as I was tidying up the dining room, after everyone had gone to bed, I felt him before I saw him. "You should be asleep," I said, without turning around. "So should you," he replied, his voice closer than I expected. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his tie loosened. There was something raw in his expression, something vulnerable that took my breath away. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, stepping into the room. "Themba, please," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I know it's wrong," he said, his tone desperate, "but I can't help it." He stepped closer, and I backed away until I was pressed against the dining table. The space between us was electric, charged with everything we weren't saying. "This can't happen," I said, though my voice betrayed me. He raised a hand, hesitating before gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was light, but it sent a shiver through me. "It doesn't have to mean anything," he said softly. "Just this moment." I closed my eyes, torn between the pull of him and the weight of what we both stood to lose. His hand lingered on my cheek, and I felt myself leaning into his touch before I snapped back to reality. "No," I said firmly, stepping away. "We can't do this. We won't." He looked at me, a mix of longing and resignation in his eyes. For a moment, I thought he might argue, but then he nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. I'm sorry. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the dimly lit room, my heart pounding and my emotions in turmoil. That was the last time we were ever alone together. From then on, we kept our distance, exchanging only polite words when necessary. The tension between us never fully disappeared, but we both knew the line we couldn't cross. And yet, late at night, when the house was quiet and the world felt still, I would catch myself thinking about him, about what almost happened, and I wondered if he did too. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Inquisco for more real and true stories like this.